In the interest of time, I think I'll go ahead and open this up. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Buildings Breakout session. I'm Carolyn Tolentino, and I'll be your moderator for this session. As a reminder, panels in the Buildings session are going to discuss, among other topics, energy-saving policies in the Netherlands, building performance standards in Europe, and the U.S. Department of Energy's Cold Climate Heat Pump Technology Challenge. So attendees should feel free to ask questions throughout the presentations via the chat, and we'll get to them at the very end during the Q&A portion. Also, I want to know that the speaker presentations are available on the symposium landing page if you would like to follow along on your own computers. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. I will be giving briefer introductions, and the full bio is available on the symposium landing page as well, if you would like to take a look at their full bio. So first up, we have Robert Dijksterhuis. Robert is the Envoy for Sustainable Building at the Netherlands Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations, a position created after the launch of the European Green Deal. He negotiates with European member states, the European Commission, and public and private stakeholders on the new policies to reduce carbon footprint of the built environment on the road towards climate neutrality by 2050, of course. Now, take it away, Robert.
Okay, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon for wherever you are. So I'm quite honored to be asked to give a small presentation about what we're doing in the Netherlands, but at the same time, I do think that it's somewhat of a doubtful honor as well, because, well, it means that we in the Netherlands are in the top 25 of highest emission countries. So basically our target would be to get eradicated from this list, and that you will never hear from us again, because we're not in the top 25 anymore. And my presentation will be a little bit about, okay, what are we going to do in the Netherlands, especially with regards to the built environment, to decrease our fossil energy use in the built environment in order to get skipped from this list. So maybe you can get to the next slide, please, Charlotte. So maybe first of all, a very brief introduction on what it is in the Netherlands. So we are quite a small country. We are only 17.6 million people with a high population density. So 90% of our population lives in an urban environment. And this population lives in about 8 million homes, and we have about 600,000 non-residential buildings, like production halls, offices, shops, etc. And we know that between now and 2050, almost all buildings will still be in use. And at the same time, we know that about 90% of all these buildings in the Netherlands have an individual heating system based on natural gas. I see someone in the chat saying that he's not able to hear me, but I hope that I am heard by others.
I can hear you.
Okay, then I'll continue. So there's the challenge we face. So we know that we have millions of buildings, and between now and 2050, when we want to be climate neutral, we have to eradicate about 7+ million individual heating systems based on natural gas. And at the same time, we have a very big housing demand. So between now and 2030, we need to build an additional 900,000 homes. So, well, that's a challenge for you. Can we go to the next, please? So, and when we're talking about the energy transition, then it's part of the European Union's Green Deal, where we have set the target that we want to reach 55% of emissions reduction by 2030 and become climate neutral by 2050. And we measure that through 3 goals. So one of them, of course, is reducing CO2 emissions, but at the same time, we also measure how quickly we are switching to renewable energy away from fossil fuels.
Your speaker is not working.
And how we are going to improve energy efficiency. So when we're talking about the built environment, then it's basically to change from what you see on the picture on the right side, from this gas-fired heating systems towards new homes with solar panels on the roof, with good insulation, and then other sources of heat. Next, please. And for that, our minister launched a new program just last week on the 2nd of April, which is called the National Program on Improving the Sustainability of the Built Environment. And this is a 5-track plan, which is combining both a district-oriented approach as well as approaching individual homes it's also about targeting non-residential buildings on resource and infrastructure and on innovation, circularity and adaptation. And I'll very briefly walk you through what's in the plan why we're choosing the combination of a district-oriented approach combined with an individual approach. And this is also what you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, that if you are targeting only homeowners, then you get a situation like in the picture that you have two homes which are very well insulated, but one in the middle said, well, sorry, but I don't have the money for it, or I don't want to insulate right now. And then, well, this is not efficient to make your built environment more sustainable. Next, please. So first of all, when we're talking about the district-oriented approach, then you have to know that we have asked all municipalities in the Netherlands to draft a heat transition vision a couple of years back already, and they had to deliver that vision at the end of last year. And there they have to indicate per district what the future fossil-free heat supply will look like. So on average, a district will be about 500 buildings. And we know that in future, okay, just virtually all buildings now have this home connection to natural gas, but they have to switch to other modes of heating. But that can differ for the location where you're at and the age of the building you're living in, etc. So there we have asked municipalities to say, okay, well, for which district do you propose that what kind of heat supply will be there in 5, 10, 20 years time? And we have started with 64 testing grounds. And you can see them on the map. So all the dots on the map are the different testing grounds where we try to learn as much as possible all the different kinds of solutions we can offer. Next, please. And this is combined with this individual approach where we say, okay, well, of course, a homeowner has to invest in energy renovation for their own homes. And for that, we can supply information where we work together with more than 20 organizations. And you can see that on the right-hand side, there's this small clip from a website we have called verbeterjehuis.nl, so how to improve your home. And you can go there and fill in the characteristics of your building. So to say, okay, this is the age of the building, it's a single family home, or it's an apartment, etc. And then if you fill this all in, then you click on OK, and then you get a targeted suggestions, a list of suggestions on what to do to improve the insulation level and the heat supply for your home, and what measures you can take as an individual homeowner. For that as well, we have included, we've launched a standard for home insulation where we say, okay, well, this is a future-proof standard. So whatever you do, if you try to insulate your home, if you insulate it up to this standard, then you know that wherever your home is laying in the Netherlands, that this is good insulation. So if in the end there will be, for instance, geothermal energy or aquathermal energy or residual heat or whatever, that doesn't really matter, but this is the best level of insulation for your home. And for that, we also provide subsidies with different kinds of subsidies, and we can provide loans as well, where we are mixing public and private credit through the National Heat Fund. So if you want, as a homeowner, to invest in your home, but well, you are lacking means, then you can go to the bank, and the bank can then provide you with a low credit loan with, a low interest loan with a long grace period, etc. And of course, we have building renovation norms and regulations, and we have a specific approach for different types of ownership. So in the Netherlands, of course, you have owner-occupied homes, including owners associations. So if you're in a big apartment building, then you have an owners association. But also we have a very large part of housing corporations who are providing housing for the lesser off people. So about 30% of all housing in the Netherlands is provided for by housing corporations in the Netherlands, which are non-profit organizations, but they are private. And of course, we have private landlords. And when it comes to the individual approach of renovating homes, then we have different targeted solutions for different types of ownership. Next, please. And then briefly something about non-residential buildings. So one of the big things, which is also in the report by ACEEE, is that we have announced already 8 years back that by 2023 there will be a label C requirement for office buildings. So this is limiting the maximum primary fossil energy use for 225 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And if you don't adhere to that standard, then the municipality can first of all fine you, but eventually will say, okay, well, this office may not be rented out anymore, which is of course quite strict. And we have sent just recently a letter to all office buildings in the Netherlands to say, okay, well, you still have some 8-9 months to deliver, and otherwise, well, you know what will happen then. Apart from that, we also have sectoral roadmaps. We say, okay, when we're talking about non-residential buildings, then when it comes to social real estate, then there's a very big difference between different types of real estate. So, for instance, a police office is quite different, or a police station is quite different from a sports facility or a school or a hospital, etc. And so what we have done is that we are sitting down together with these specific sectors and have drafted roadmaps at portfolio level with these organizations, how they are going to improve the energy efficiency of their buildings. To sit down together and say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do for primary and secondary education, because those kinds of schools are more or less the same, of course, and they are different from, say, a hospital, etc. Next, please. So, and then that's, I'm winding up already. So, so the number 4 and 5 of our five-track approach is when it comes to resources and infrastructure, then we say, okay, well, if you want to eradicate natural gas, then we do, of course, need to have good alternative systems. And for that, we are investing in a stable investment climate and better preconditions for these sustainable alternatives. And that can be an all-electric solution or green gas or aquathermal energy, geothermal, etc. Whatever the business case is best per different district in the Netherlands. And so we as a government are working together with municipalities, with provinces in trying to improve the climate, to start investing in these kinds of alternative heat sources. And finally, we are investing in innovation, because we see that in the Netherlands, as well as in the rest of Europe for that matter, there's a very big demand in the construction sector. There's also a shortage of products in the construction sector. So, but at the same time, we need to double or even triple the renovation rate. So we need to improve labor productivity in the construction sector. So we need to industrialize, we need to digitize construction. And at the same time, we need also to pay much more attention for circularity and climate change adaptation. So those are the challenges we face. And well, that's what we're going to forward. Thank you very much. To the final slide, and then I'm running off.
Thank you, Robert. A really quick question that I think you can answer in just a couple of seconds. Someone asked, will there be any exemptions for historically valuable buildings such as churches or museums?
Yes and no. They are not fully exempted from taking climate action. So we do tell every building owner in the Netherlands that by 2050, your building will be fossil fuel free. So you have to change something. But of course, what we do note is that, well, a monumental building, we're not going to change the way the building looks because of insulation measures. So we try to sit down together with the monument owners to see, okay, what is possible for this specific building. But they're not fully exempted.
I see. Thanks, Robert. Okay, now we're going to hear from Louise Sunderland. Louise is Senior Advisor for the Regulatory Assistance Project, working on demand-side energy policies and energy justice. She's worked on energy efficiency and sustainability in the energy and building sector for 15 years. She's also an external expert for the European Commission and has served as an expert witness to provide evidence to the United Kingdom's House of Lords. The floor is yours, Louise.
Thanks very much. I've just been looking at the chat, and I'd like to chime in with those people saying that they are very impressed with the Netherlands. It's also one of my favourite countries in terms of inspiration for energy efficiency, particularly in the building sector. So I just wanted to highlight that conversation I really very much agree with. But what I'm going to do now is just highlight what I think is a really, perhaps one of the most interesting new bold policy innovations in the area of existing buildings and renovation that I've seen in recent years. It's the standards that have been taken up, particularly actually in Europe and the US. If you are in different jurisdictions, you will know them as from different names. If you're in Europe, you'll know them as minimum energy performance standards. If you're in the US, you'll know them as building performance standards. And really interestingly, you can see that the 3 countries with the top spots of the scorecard actually make really good use of these standards and have introduced them in recent years. So super relevant to our discussions today. Next slide, please. And I probably don't need to dwell too long on this, but existing buildings really are just such an important element of our decarbonisation challenge. We know that globally 50% of today's buildings will be in use in 2050, but actually particularly for North America and Europe, because we have a lot more older buildings in our stocks, as you can see from the dark blue bars on the left-hand side of this chart, and a lot more of our existing stock will still be around in 2050, then the existing stock is actually a much bigger part of the problem. Next slide, please. And in Europe, this slide really tells the story. So in Europe, we're expecting 85% of 2050's buildings to have already been built. And this chart kind of tells the story of how well we're doing basically in decarbonising. The blue bars on the left show us the progress we've been making in reducing emissions, and the red dashed line shows us the trajectory we need to be on to meet our statutory 2030 climate targets for Europe as a whole. And you can see very clearly that the policies we have been working. We are reducing emissions, but really not enough. So the building labelling, the information, the incentives, the subsidies, the renovation programs that we have had in place to date are working, but they are clearly not enough, and we need to be looking beyond. Next slide, please. So this, I think, is the context in which the minimum energy performance standards, or building performance standards rather, come. What are these standards? Well, quite simply, they are regulations that require existing buildings to meet a minimum performance standard at a chosen point in time. Sounds simple. They are probably most similar to things that we're very familiar with, most similar to building codes. They are quite different to building codes, though, in 2 most important ways. So the first way in which minimum energy performance standards are different to building codes, where building codes extend to existing buildings, is that they apply to the whole building. Very often when our building codes extend to existing buildings, they apply to the element being renovated, the element being replaced, whereas these standards apply to the whole building and the performance or energy use or carbon use in those whole buildings. The second really important area is that they apply even when no building works trigger the application of the code. So they can actually apply to entire elements of the stock, even when there are no building works triggers. And you can see there that actually applying to the whole buildings and applying to the whole parts of the stock, that they are potentially much, much more impactful than building codes alone. So next slide, please. Sorry about the slight odd formatting on these slides. I've got a bit weird, but I'm sure the slides are available on the website if you'd like to look at them afterwards. As I've said, these are new, relatively, well, there's certainly new interest in these standards being introduced in a number of jurisdictions across the world. And I've looked at a lot of them, whether they be in the US, in Europe, or even actually some in Australia and New Zealand. And they're all designed in quite different ways, but they all follow this formula. So they identify the target buildings, And actually in different jurisdictions, you see quite different elements of buildings being, rather different sectors of buildings being targeted. So for example, the new US building performance standards tend to go for the big emitters. So they tend to look at the big commercial buildings, or some of them also multifamily buildings. Whereas actually in New Zealand and Australia, and a lot of the standards in Europe, they're looking at homes. And looking actually to set a sort of minimum energy efficiency decency standard, I suppose, for homes. So you can see obviously addressing different sectors for different reasons. Then they identify the standard to be met, and very importantly, the metric used to define that standard. And that could be either a carbon standard, CO2 per meter squared per year, or an energy performance standard, kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, as we've already heard Didier talk about with in the example in France. And then of course the trigger point comes. All of the standards I've seen have a firm date by which the buildings in the sectors targeted need to meet the standard. And then very often there is a phase-in period before that firm date, whereby a trigger point in the building life cycle is used. So you might have a standard introduced and buildings only buildings being sold or rented out under a new contract, for example, are required to be renovated to meet the standard for the first, say, 5 years. And then there's a firm date whereby all those buildings, even if they haven't been sold or rented in that period, meet the standard. Next slide, please. So to kind of make this come to life a little bit, some of the examples, and I've chosen examples here from Europe and actually from the 3 countries leading the scorecard: France, the Netherlands, and the countries of the United Kingdom. And you can see here, well, you could see if it hadn't fallen off the screen, but the standards are targeting actually different buildings in different countries. So targeting both non-domestic buildings and homes. And you'll see actually in all the examples that I've chosen, they're using an EPC level. This is the energy performance certification system across Europe. So if you go on to the next slide, I'll just pause briefly to explain to those who don't know what that is. So next slide, please. Because clearly, as I've mentioned, having a metric that's suitable to define one of these regulations is absolutely essential. So having a metric and some data is really important at underpinning the ability to introduce these regulations. And across Europe, we have the European Energy Performance Certificate Framework, which is a building assessment and labelling framework. It's required by the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and member states design and implement at a national level. The assessment is required when buildings are newly built or sold or rented out. And the label has a kind of easy to communicate A to G, a bit like an appliance label efficiency rating. Underpinning those A to G labels is usually an energy performance band, a kilowatt hour per meter squared per year band. However, I would say that these are required for all European member states, but they're not harmonized, which means countries introduce the assessments and the labeling frameworks in different ways. So next slide, please. In some countries, just go back to the, in some countries, could you go back to, please? Thank you, perfect. In some countries, they might have selected an A+ to an F range, or an A to an H range, for example. So in general, it's an A to G, but there are anomalies. And it is also important to point out that a C class, for example, in all European member states does not mean the same level of performance, but because of course the labelling and assessment frameworks were built from the bottom up in that country in relation to the national stock conditions and also the climatic region. So next slide, please. So just to say, these standards are not all completely comparable on their letter, the EPC letter used. So very briefly running through, in the Netherlands, we've already heard there's the EPC C label for offices. In France and actually in England and Wales, they've taken very similar approaches, which is to target the 2 worst performing bands, so the Gs and the Fs, and require them to be renovated to the E label, and that standard is directed at homes. And then fallen off the bottom of this, but we mustn't forget it, is a really interesting standard, not yet regulated, but it introduced in a new buildings strategy from Scotland. And they are proposing that all homes be EPC label C. And what's so super interesting about this standard is that it's being introduced hand in hand in conjunction with a proposal to phase out the use of fossil fuel heating. So they're using an energy efficiency standard really as a precursor then to enable homes to be fully decarbonised through the phase out of the primarily gas boilers that are used in the country. Next slide, please. And really, I think perhaps the most exciting news that we have at the moment in Europe is that there is a proposal currently being negotiated that will mean that, if accepted, would mean the extension of these minimum energy performance standards to every country in Europe. So this is a proposal made back in, originally published in December last year by the European Commission. As I say, it's currently under negotiation by policymakers. Next slide, please. And a quick summary of the proposal is that it's following really the approach taken by France and England and Wales, addressing the worst two performing bands, the Gs and the Fs, and asking them to be renovated up to E, with slightly different timelines for domestic and non-domestic buildings, but by the early 2030s. Really importantly, and very, very importantly for impact, this is going to apply to all buildings, as I say, domestic and non-domestic, slightly different timelines for the two. Just one more clip, please. And another very important part of the proposal is that this is also based on some level of harmonisation of the EPC scales. So member states, as part of this proposal, will be required to all use the A to G scale and to classify the 15% worst performing buildings as Gs. So you can sort of see from this harmonisation, the sort of level of ambition we're sort of pushing for with this standard, which may see anywhere between 50 and 30% of the worst performing European buildings renovated to this E standard by the early 2030s. As yet, we don't know exactly what that E standard might be. That will be different for every country, as I've said, due to climatic and stock condition reasons. So this is the big news at the moment. This is currently under negotiation. Next slide, please, and final slide, which is just to say that I really do think these policies are very, very important. I think, as we've seen in the front-running countries from the scorecard, the standards being adopted by ambitious countries, it would be very significant if they were introduced across Europe. However, they are not the silver bullet alone. Regulations, I think, are important. They're very clear signals. I think we need these clear backstops right now, but they don't make this successful renovations at the building level. So it's clear that within the Buildings Directive and within national frameworks, there are a lot of other elements that are needed. I've already talked about the importance of the building assessments, the building labels and the data, but also in the directive, we see a big focus on technical support and financial support to building owners to get the renovations done, to get them done well, and to get them financed. Also, a huge focus at the moment in Europe on safeguards to make sure that these renovations don't become extra burdens, that the requirement to renovate doesn't become an extra burden on those households that are already suffering terrible burdens from energy costs and housing costs. And of course, as I think both Robert and Didier earlier mentioned, the effective enforcement of these standards will be absolutely essential to their impact. And so that's all for me. Just the next slide and my contact details. Very happy to discuss this.
Thanks so much, Louise. Next up is Lee Smith. Lee is passionate about ongoing decarbonization and electrification initiatives. And in his current role as Vice President of Strategic Marketing, Advocacy, and Applications Development for Daikin US Corporation, he is responsible for leading market transformation initiatives for Daikin's key technologies such as inverter, heat pumps for space and water heating, and lower GWP refrigerants. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Carolyn, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to close out the presentation part of today to talk about the DOE Cold Climate Heat Pump Challenge. Next slide, please. But before I do that, I wanted to quickly give some background to the kind of market conditions we have here in North America, the US specifically, relative to air source heat pumps, the penetration of that technology, as well as the factors that have been affecting the trust relative to heat pumps in the market up to this point. And then we'll jump into the cold climate stuff. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this is a little bit of a busy chart. The penetration rate of ducted unitary heat pumps varies dramatically from state to state. And you can also see that the majority of states highlighted in green are dominated by cooling-only systems that are connected to a gas furnace for the main source of heat, or the source of heat in the winter. You would think that in mild climates, so kind of south of the Mason-Dixon line, there would be a much higher adoption of heat pumps. And while some states do show that, you can see it's still, limited in terms of the penetration and lots of room to grow. From the insights that we collect in our daily activities, there's essentially a lack of trust from dealers to promote heat pumps. And this stems from technologies that are long since been replaced, but also there's challenges in dealing with load calculations relative to the heating side of systems. And there's also challenges in articulating the real running cost, operating cost benefits over the life cycle of the equipment when compared to traditional natural gas-based solutions. Next slide, please. So when we try and dig into the factors that stimulate the lack of trust, essentially, as you can see, the heating load ratio to cooling load ratio can vary dramatically. So for example, in a home that requires 3 tons of cooling is going to be calculated to need perhaps 3.5 to 4 tons of heating, even in the mild climates. As you go to the colder climates, this ratio is increased by more than 2.5 times. In the worst case, up to 3 times that of the cooling load is the calculated heating load for cold regions. So the heat pump capacity is often seen as being insufficient to meet the load and the needs of the home. Next slide, please. As a compound to this, the most common solution used in the marketplace today are what we would call non-inverter compressorized systems. This is a compressor that switches on and off in accordance with the load. And the way that those systems are typically configured into homes is to use electric heat. That electric heat is there to provide a means of emergency heat if the heat pump is not operating, or supplemental heat if the heat pump doesn't have the necessary capacity to meet the load of the home on the worst case days of the year, shall we say. What we actually see is the deployment of those electric heaters often doesn't take advantage of the capability of the heat pump that's installed. So what homeowners see and what dealers hear about is, my system is costing me a lot of money to operate. And that's because it's not operating as a heat pump where you would see that normal, 300, 400% efficiency. It's running as an electric heater, so your efficiency is essentially a COB of 1. This is compounded in colder regions where the cost of electricity is 4 to 6 times higher than gas. And gas prices are particularly low in the Midwest, the Northeast. So even trying to move people towards the idea of hybrid or dual fuel solutions, leveraging both heat pumps and gas furnaces on the same system, can often have very little merit. Many of the incentives for heat pumps are less impactful, and the inconsistency from location to location in what those metrics are to realize the incentives make them quite cumbersome for dealers to holistically utilize as well. Next slide, please. So the purpose of those slides was really to set the scene and really, to applaud the DOE to recognize that there is a need to stimulate market transformation towards heat pumps, especially in cold climates, but more so across the length and breadth of the country. So the objective of the Cold Climate Heat Pump Challenge is to accelerate the development and then the deployment of cold climate heat pump technologies. So the goal is to work collaboratively between the DOE and heat pump manufacturers to develop these solutions, validate the performance, not just in the lab, but also in the field, launch pilot programs with key partners such as utilities, etc., and ultimately to identify and alleviate installation challenges associated with heat pumps today. The scope of the challenge is focused on centrally ducted electric-only heat pumps that perform better than today's products. The targeted capacity range is from a nominal 2 ton of capacity up to 5 ton, which represents, the pretty common equipment capacities that are used in homes today. The systems must comply with all applicable federal and state standards. And to meet the designation of cold climate, they need to obviously perform very, very effectively and efficiently in cold climates. So the challenge sets out specific requirements based on a 5-degree Fahrenheit and a -15-degree Fahrenheit condition. What's quite interesting about this challenge is it's requiring manufacturers to utilize lower GWP refrigerants. So those refrigerant options that have a GWP, a global warming potential, that is less than 750 based on the AR4 ratings. And it's also requiring manufacturers to incorporate advanced controls and grid connectivity. The final part of the challenge is technologies that have already become well established as cold climate solutions in North America, such as ductless systems, multi-split systems, are out of scope for this particular project. Hybrid and dual fuel systems are also out of scope, and commercial grade equipment is also out of scope. Next slide, please. So when the challenge was proposed, there was a challenge hypothesis. As you can see, it's broken down into basically 2 main points. So the first one is seasonal heating and cooling performance. What's interesting with this particular one is the minimum heating performance, so the seasonal performance factor, has to be tested and rated to the region 5 conditions. So heat pumps today in the US are tested and rated to a region 4 condition, which doesn't test the systems to as low an ambient condition. Region 5 stretches the ambient range of testing and obviously determines the efficacy and performance of the system in a more like condition to how they will be installed. The first challenge is to basically meet a heating requirement of 5 degrees, and that the nominal capacity of the system can be maintained all the way down to 5 degrees. So if your system is a 48,000 BTU system, a 4-ton system that has a nominal heating capacity of 54,000 BTUs, you must still deliver that 54,000 BTUs at the 5-degree point. But the goal was to have a COP of 2.8 at 5 degrees. And then as an extension of the challenge to cover even colder climates, to develop solutions that would heat down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit and provide a capacity maintenance or a capacity ratio of 70% of that nominal capacity and a COP of 2.3. Next slide. After quite some discussion between the DOE and the DOE partners and all of the manufacturers, the majority of target specifications were basically maintained. The main difference from what was the original hypothesis to the final spec is the goal for COP. And the COP goal, as you can see, is a 2.4 COP for 2 ton to less than 4 ton, and then a 2.1 COP at 5 degrees for greater than 4 ton. But all of the other criteria and requirements were retained. What this particular specification also requires is that because of the variable capacity requirements for capacity turn down, the systems that will be developed will all be inverter or variable speed based systems. So this is a very important kind of market development to modernize the types of air source heat pumps that are being more widely deployed into homes in North America. Next slide, please. One of the key challenges with not just heat pumps, but all air conditioning systems is the controlling the quality of installation. So aligned with Energy Star, the Cold Climate Heat Pump Challenge is requiring installation capabilities to be maintained as well, such as validation of refrigerant charge, airflow, fan power draw, automatic system discovery and programming, and then communication capabilities for consumer alerts, energy reporting, and demand response integration as well. So what this is doing is it's really systemizing the heat pump solution, taking into effect the fact that the thermostat, as well as the actual heat pump itself, need to work in tandem with one another. When you decouple, which has been the case in the past, you lose a lot of inherent opportunities to improve user experience, system performance, and ultimately system efficiency. Next slide, please. So there was a great deal of progress last year when the challenge was announced. There is, I'm very happy to say, a wide array of participants in the actual challenge. You can see not just Daikin, there's actually Carrier that's kind of hidden. I don't know what's happened with the formatting of these slides. I have the same issue. But JCI, Lennox, LG, Midea, Mitsubishi, Rheem, and Trane Technologies are all active participants in this challenge. Everybody is now working on developing their prototypes, and will work on lab testing and field testing later this year, with a goal to deploy these solutions into the marketplace around the end of 2023, the beginning of 2024. So a very exciting timeline, a very exciting challenge, and lots of great participants as well. And next slide, please. So I wanted to end, it says request, it's really a comment. The reality is heat pumps have a large amount of opportunity and room to grow in North America, but they continue to be somewhat marginalized, stemming from their legacy performance, deployment, and reputation. What I would advocate for is, in our daily activities, let's change the discussion. Let's focus our discussion, our communication activities and actions to talk about inverter variable speed heat pumps. These are the systems that can solve the necessary challenges in homes and commercial buildings across the full ambient scale. And I think we need to, reinvent the understanding and the awareness of heat pumps around inverter heat pumps in North America. The pathway to decarbonization and eventual electrification of space heating requires a much more dynamic and integrated approach. So again, this DOE Cold Climate Challenge is recognizing that by systemizing the requirements. And again, I think we all can do a better job of how we communicate the benefit of complete communicating and connected systems. And then how do we normalize engagement? Market transformation activities are happening in a very patchwork way today across various states, driven by RIO initiatives like NEEP and NEA. But incentives and rebates are a critical driver to that market transformation. Normalizing eligibility criteria, performance metrics that target the most appropriate technologies like inverter heat pumps with communicating controls is really where we should all be focused to create the pathways necessary to migrate the market to adopt these technologies in a much more widespread way than they have been up to this point. And with that, I think that's my last slide. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Lee, and thank you to all of our speakers for their engaging presentations. We're switching over to the Q&A portion now, and if you haven't already, please submit your questions in the chat. I will select from there and ask our panelists to get their thoughts on those. To jumpstart the discussion, I will start with a question of my own. We all know how important equity is to these conversations and how we have to ensure that all of our communities are included in these solutions and consulted as well. So I'm curious I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about how we can advance and prioritize equity in these building policies and in market transformation for these technologies. And what are some successful examples that you have seen?
Okay, should I start? Well, in the Netherlands, within the National Insulation Program we launched last week, our minister also said that we are going to tackle, first of all, the worst performing buildings in the Netherlands. And you have to know that the most worst performing buildings are also the buildings where the people with the least budgets are living. So we have said that between now and 2030, we want to renovate 1.5 million worst performing buildings, so the label G and H in the lineup of Louise Sunderland. And we know for a fact that tackles most of the people with small budgets. And we do that through dedicated support. So both through the housing corporations, which I mentioned in my presentation, because they provide social housing, so we can target them quite quickly, because, well, we know that most people with small budgets don't own a house in the Netherlands, they rent a house. So if you are going to talk with the owner of the house, which can be a housing corporation or a private rental organization, then you know how to deal with that. So that's what we tackle. And, well, we do focus mostly on that category of houses.
I'll just contribute. I think, as Robert has said, my interest actually in minimum energy performance standards came from the point of view of how do we renovate the homes? How do we ensure the renovations get to the homes of the low-income people first? And exactly as Robert said, a really key way of targeting renovations, targeting support, is actually targeting by energy efficiency, because we know households with low incomes tend to end up in the worst performing homes. So I think those regulations are really important, particularly, as Robert has said, when very often low income households don't own their own homes, and so they aren't in control of the renovation. I think undoubtedly as well, the next most important thing is the funding and finance. And I don't think we see enough, particularly in Europe, we don't see enough countries yet having a really full matrix of subsidies, grants, appropriate finance, on-bill schemes, and all of the other tools, financial tools that we're going to need to make sure that every household has the access to the right kind of finance and the right kind of support. And I think the real realization is that for a lot of households, that they are going to need up to 100% subsidy to get the renovations done. And I know today is about energy efficiency, but I would also like to look beyond that. I think we need to follow through with this, prioritizing the low-income households first into our decarbonisation strategies. We cannot leave our lowest income households supporting redundant infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure. So obviously the fewer users we have on a gas system, for example, it's the fewer users between whom the costs of that gas infrastructure are shared. And so my real fears are that we've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of prioritizing low-income households, both in energy efficiency, absolutely, but also in making sure that they can decarbonize actually very quickly and not be left with these escalating volatile prices of fossil fuels that we're seeing, in all too real terms at the moment.
It's also, just to add maybe very quickly, sorry Lee, so right now, also in the Netherlands, we have seen energy prices, gas prices rising for about 20% in the last semester. So, and of course that particularly affects the low-income households. So it becomes a very big political debate right now as well, that we need to do something with the worst performing buildings because they have seen their energy bills rising steeply recently. And so energy poverty is on the rise, and we have to do something about that quickly. So it's a very hot political debate right now in the Netherlands. Also because of the Ukraine crisis, I must add, because we are getting gas from Russia, and we want to get away from gas from Russia because, well, we were basically funding the war in the Ukraine. So that's another issue on dealing with gas and switching to other ways of energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge that, you know, we all have to figure out collectively as an industry, you know, and there's lots of good examples coming into play in pretty progressive markets like in New York, as well as in California. But the challenge is the life cycle side of things. There's a lot of tax incentives and rebates and things like that available to help with the upfront cost of equipment. There's a lot of programs to stimulate providing equipment to low and middle income households as well. But the running cost is still the main area. So until we see wholesome changes to how we sell electricity and how we reward people for electrifying, whether it's type of use rates or, you know, seasonal offsets in the cost per kilowatt hour for using heat pumps in the winter and things like that, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult because that life cycle cost burden is something that can be very, very
Okay.
Looks like
Seems
we
to be
are
going
remove
fairly smoothly after we figured out how to get everybody into breakouts.
Yes, it looks like they reopened the prior breakout session, so I believe Nick is recreating with the new breakout sessions.
Okay. Hello, Marilyn. Oops. Goodbye, Marilyn.
I'm only able to talk now. I had a little thing done on my cheek. I'm trying to go camouflage it.
That's fine.
But I enjoyed this first breakout. It was great on buildings.